In this lecture, we're going to learn how to use slots in our component files. Slots are a great way to pass down content from a parent component to a child component. They are an alternative to using props. Slots are very popular among library developers. It would be beneficial to understand how they're used. They can be really useful when you need to make your code more reusable. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at a real use case example. We'll be working on a new project for this example. In the command line, run the following command: npm init vue at latest. During the setup process, set the name of the project to slots. Next, select no as the response to all questions. We're going to be working with the bare minimum. Lastly, we'll move into the new directory. The packages must be installed. Run the npm install command. Next, let's start the server with the npm run dev command. Let's do some cleanup. In the components directory, delete all component files. We won't need them for this demonstration. Up next, we'll update the app component. We're going to remove the style block from the component. Then, we'll strip the template and script blocks to the bare minimum. From the script block, export an object under the default namespace. Set the name property to app. We're ready. Let's start working with slots. Inside the template, we're going to create a simple form. The form will have 3 intersections. We'll use div tags to create these sections. The sections will be called help, fields, and buttons. The help section will contain some help text to inform the user on how to fill out the form. The fields section will hold the input fields. Lastly, the buttons section will hold the submission buttons. We're going to fill out each of these sections quickly. This is how forms are typically built. You split everything into sections to keep your markup structured. It's a common methodology of approaching forms. I'm not using any expressions or directives inside the form. It's just plain HTML. You can think of this as a login form. We can improve the form by putting it into its own component. It's getting rather large, so placing the logic in a separate component would be a good idea. Let's do that. Inside the components directory, create a file called form.vue. We'll add the template block to the file. We're not going to bother with the script block at the moment. The goal is to move the form into a separate component. We'll cut the form element from the app component. Then, we'll paste it into the template block of the form component. We'll want to register the component locally. Switching back to the app component, we'll import the form component. Next, we'll register the component by adding the components object to the exported object. We're prefixing the name with the word app. That's because there's already an element called form. We don't want to have a naming conflict. This is another reason why it's always considered good practice to namespace your component names. Back in the app component file, we'll add the form component where the form was originally located. I'm lowercasing the words and adding a dash between them. This is an alternative way to write components. In an earlier lecture, I talked about how you can use kebab case or Pascal case for your component names. If you opt into using Pascal case, Vue will allow you to write the component with lowercase letters. It'll add a dash before each letter that was capitalized with the exception of the first one. We can use the original name, but I like to use the lowercase version because it keeps things consistent inside the HTML. Native HTML elements are always lowercase. Alright, let's move on over to the browser. Surely enough, the form gets rendered. There's nothing wrong with the form, but there are some limitations with the component. A form is a common UI element in any application. It's likely that you'll have multiple forms. Some examples would be a login form, register form, contact form, etc. They may have different input fields and objectives. However, they may look visually consistent. This means you're probably using the same markup structure and classes. It isn't just forms that suffer from this problem. Most UI elements are reusable. If we were to go back to the application, we wouldn't be able to reuse the component. Instead, we would have to create another component if we wanted to reuse the form. Let's say we wanted to create a contact form. The contact form would use the same base HTML, but with different input fields. I want to be able to reuse the form component. We could do this a number of ways. For example, we could use props and pass down the stylings and fields. That's a viable solution, but passing down HTML through props isn't really fun. This is especially true if you have complex markup. The recommended solution is to use slots. We'll create the second form in a moment, but first let's explore how to create a slot. Before using slots, you need to identify which parts of your component are reusable or unique. Inside the form component, the markup that will be unique are the 3 sections inside the form. I'm going to cut all 3 sections. Then I'll transfer them over back to the app component. We're going to paste the markup inside the app form component like so. Vue allows us to pass down markup in between the components tags like we're doing here. However, this won't work just yet. We have to instruct Vue where to render the markup in the child component that's receiving the markup. Switching to the form component, we're going to insert a tag called slot. We'll insert it inside the form element. The slot tag we're using is a component created by Vue. It'll get replaced by the content that gets passed from the parent component. Let's move over to the browser to view the result. The form renders normally. Slots are a way to pass down markup from the parent component to the child component. In this instance, we're passing down these sections to the form. The slot tag we have inside the form component will be replaced with the content passed in. There may be some scenarios where no content will be passed in. We have the option of rendering default content. Back in the editor, in between the slot tags, we can add some default content. We'll add the following: no form to render. If content is not passed down from the parent component, Vue will use the content inside the slot component. We can test that out by switching over to the app component and using the form component twice. For the second copy, we'll leave it empty. Hopping on over to the browser, we will see the first form rendering. The second form will have the message inside the slot rendering. Having default content is optional and can be useful just in case you forget something. This is the basics of creating slots. We'll stop here. In the next one, we'll look at how we can further improve this solution.